Very excited to welcome Noam Bardin, Chief Wazer over at Google, and Alexandra Suich from The Economist to discuss the present and future of navigation with Noam and the innovative ways that Waze is making every car smart. Yes.
Thank you, everyone. That was a tough act to follow, though. I feel like I was just watching a late-night comedy show just there. So.
And I really want to thank Yossi for the warm introduction and the support for a fellow Israeli. Thank you very much.
All right, well, this is a fun interview for me. I'm a frequent Waze user. And so I'd love you to answer a question, which is a frequent topic of conversation between every Uber driver I'm talking to and me, which is why is Google Maps separate from Waze still?
So Google Maps and Waze are still extremely separate. We actually don't report to the same structure within Google. We run on different technology stacks. We actually built our own maps, which are not the same. At the same time, we share a lot of data on the back end. So we allow us to share the data. And a lot of people ask me that question within Google, well, why do we have these two apps? And I think the only people that don't ask that question are actual users of the app. So they're very different apps. They have very different experience. And they deliver a very different type of experience in terms of how deep they go into which use case. So Google Maps provides everything, everywhere, walking, transit, et cetera. Very big emphasis on search. Waze is about driving and more narrowly about commuting, and we've decided to go deeper and deeper into that use case and not wider into other use cases.
So, but is there no benefit to shared intelligence?
No, so we share a lot of data on the back end.
You do?
We definitely do share a lot of data, and you'll see events and reports from Waze showing up on Google Maps, and if you search through Waze, you'll get a lot of the Google search value and things like that.
So it's sort of like Facebook owning WhatsApp and then building Messenger, homegrown, different use cases.
Now, that's going to be my next answer. I'm going to take that answer next time I'm asked that question. That's exactly what I meant.
Okay, but I'm glad to be of help. With WhatsApp and Messenger, the user bases are also very different geographies, et cetera. Similar for Waze and Google Maps?
Not so much in terms of geographies. So obviously the US is our biggest market, and we sort of track where there is traffic. So Los Angeles is obviously very big, in Washington, DC, et cetera. But we track differently. I think there are different use cases. When we ask our users, they basically say, I use Google Maps for this and this and this, and I use Waze for this. And so I think from a user perspective, it's very clear the different use cases. From a high-level strategy, a type of direction, you can say, well, they're both navigation apps. But I don't think there's any user who would get mixed up which app they're using at any given moment.
Okay. Are you a believer that in the next 20 years, people are not going to want to own their own cars?
Very strongly.
What does that do to maps?
So I do think so my kids are 11 and 12, and they're probably a little bit too old already. But friends of mine who have babies now, their babies will probably never own a car. They may drive a car, they may not. I mean, we'll see how that happens. And there's a whole variety of different services that are coming out. Obviously, everyone likes to talk about self-driving cars as a big component. You think about Uber and Lyft are doing, and another side of things. You think about car sharing and Zipcar and all these different things. Owning a car is kind of a silly thing. A car gets used about 3 to 4% of its time. While if you think about Los Angeles, most of the real estate in Los Angeles is contributed to cars. Roads and parking take up most of it. So it's not logical, right? Now it's a question of how do we actually unlock this value, which is going to be seen. Maps are at the core of a lot of this. It's at the core of the back end of this, the front end of this. But I think the whole idea of mapping and navigation is going to change pretty dramatically. It already has. So I moved to the States in 2010 with Waze. So I've never been in California without Waze. So I have no idea where any road is or where anything is. I cannot drive anywhere. I just have no geographical perception here at all. And I think if you think about a generation that's growing up with Google Maps and with Waze and with these kinds of things, they're really not going to have any idea. So I think a lot of things are changing the way we perceive maps and the way we perceive navigation, and the same thing with cars.
So for a lot of your data is crowdsourced. What happens with self-driving cars? I don't want to dwell too much on this, but I'm curious, like your vision for Waze in an era where people are totally passengers.
So I'll give an example. I think it was a month ago, we released an SDK for transportation networks and for on-demand delivery networks. And so Lyft just announced a few days ago that their drivers are now going to have Waze embedded together with them through this SDK. So I do see a lot of things going back and forth in terms of data and systems being connected. The flip side, when a person's a passenger, there's a lot more they can do. it's a whole new way, sort of range of things open up as a passenger, which again, we haven't thought of yet because we're still drivers. So I'm definitely sure that my kids will use Waze differently than I'm using Waze, but I'm sure it still will be a big part of how they transport themselves from place to place.
Okay. Waze is a fascinating concept because you took existing sensors and crowdsourcing to create this new tool. Do you see, if you weren't playing in mapping, where else does that opportunity exist right now?
So it's interesting. We actually do a lot of other things now, trying to build on this network. And what we actually have, we have people all over the world who contribute. And we use that a lot for driving, but we have relationships with governments around the world, departments of transportation, cities, where if you're going to report on Waze, you're going to report something on the road, that's going to arrive at the desk of the transport person within that municipality, and they will dispatch a car to actually deal with whatever it is. Washington, D.C. did that around potholes. So it was a pretty significant winter last winter. They did a week-long pothole palooza, where if you'd report a pothole on Waze, within 48 hours, they committed to have someone go out there and actually close the pothole, fix it.
It just took one report?
Just
one report, and they would do it?
Well, these things at Waze tend to be concentrated on multiple reports, right? And that's how we prioritize, obviously, what they did. But all these kinds of things are coming from this idea that people really are interesting sensors. We have a crisis group that deals with different, when there's a hurricane, when different things go out today, they actually will help deal with, for example, where is there gas for your car, right? And these are the kind of things that the users are very good at crowdsourcing. So what we've always prided ourselves at Waze is combining sensors and people. And that combination we see as something very, very interesting that can do a lot more than just what we're doing.
Do you think the barriers to entry are so high in mapping that we're not going to see another major startup come in and disrupt the mapping business?
I think there's a major startup right now who's building their mapping business, Uber, right? And Uber is building, allegedly, לפי מקורות זרים, as foreign correspondents have said. But if you look at Uber's, they're hiring pretty aggressively. They've got a tremendous amount of data coming off their cars. They're building a map, right? They hired the person who built the maps at Google. Brian McClendon's running that today at Uber. But again, I think when Uber are building a map, they're building a map from a different concept than the traditional idea of a map. But they need a map that's much more about routing and real-time traffic and historical traffic and patterns and planning and things like that.
Right.
I'm not sure if they're going to go out and actually build the presentation layer and the names of the streets and all kinds of things like that.
Well, and also it will presumably be proprietary, won't it?
Probably. But you think about self-driving cars. Every self-driving car company is building their own map. It's a map that looks at, recognizes different things and allows the car to find itself. It's a map that's built with lasers and built with proximity sensors and all kinds of other things. So I think there are going to be more and more of these maps that are going to be built for specific use cases. I don't think there'll be many more consumer maps as we know them. I think in that sense, the overhead of building a map is so large, and and there's so many sources today for mapping that I have a hard time seeing someone coming from scratch saying, I'm going to go and do exactly what Waze did from scratch. Right. Again, today. But there will be a lot of different maps that are very, very hyper-targeted to specific use cases.
So if you weren't doing something in the mapping space, what would you be doing? It's kind of like every novelist is working on a different concept. Even if they're working on one book, they have something on a side project that they flirt with. What would you like to be doing if you weren't doing mapping?
I think saving the world would be cool.
You're not doing it now?
No, but I'm playing
one
with the idea.
One pothole at a time?
Something around saving the world would probably work.
What would that look like?
And that's, being at Google, that's the goal, right? Save the world, isn't that?
Yeah.
No, I don't. Right now I'm still at Google. I'm a vice president at Google. I run Waze. But I also have another project that I'm doing cross Google wide, which I've also brought to the Tel Aviv office. And one of the interesting things, talk about Israel and Dealmakers and things like that, one of the challenges that a lot of Israeli companies have when they're part of a larger conglomerate is that the center of weight moves, in our case, to Mountain View, other cases to corporate, and Israel becomes a technology center on the side. And when you're a technology center and you're far away from the core of the corporate, over time, you're going to be the first one who gets cut on the downside. And what we've tried to do, definitely with Waze, is actually keep the product and engineering and center of weight of the company in Israel. And that's created a situation, so we were acquired about 100 people when we were acquired. We're about 250 now. About 200 of them are in Israel, and we plan to be about 315 next year. And so keeping that center of weight and excellence allows the decision-making to happen locally. Same thing with this other project that I'm doing now. We're building it in the Google Israel office to be a center of excellence for Google. And we're actually trying to bring projects from Mountain View to Israel. And I think this is sort of the change that people talk all the kind of change how the Israeli technology scene is changing. I think it's one of the more important ones is to begin looking at product and product as part of technology, but sitting in market in Israel rather than a back-end technology play.
Any other advice you'd give to Israeli entrepreneurs who ask for it? Like, what's the kind of finest grain of wisdom you've gleaned in your years out here and in Israel both?
Wow. The one thing that if I told them that, everything would work out, right?
There's always,
right.
Yep.
Wow, that's... follow me on Twitter. That would be the most important thing. I don't know. It's people love asking that kind of question. What is and the interesting thing about startups is every startup is completely different, and every story is completely different. And when you actually go through what actually happened with each startup and the challenges they went through, it's very, very different. And the times changed pretty dramatically. When we got started at Waze, when I joined Waze as CEO in the beginning of 2009, first question I had to deal with was, are we going to develop a version for BlackBerry or for iPhone? And the logical answer was BlackBerry, by the way, for people who were not there. Luckily, I wouldn't be sitting here if I'd made that decision, but that was the logical answer, right? BlackBerry had the market. You talk about sensors. One of the big questions were, will there be GPS sensors in every phone? That was a question, it was a risk factor in the company. Today, we're in a very different world, right? And we're sort of, I believe, towards the end of the app ecosystem and the beginning of the bot ecosystem. And so, we're seeing in each one of these ecosystems, reality changes and what has to happen changes. The one thing, though, that I think remains the same throughout everything is the need for really exceptional people. And that's something that doesn't ever change. It doesn't matter what company it is, whatever. And that's the one place I would say, never cut corners on that. It's just, there's no way back from cutting corners on the quality of the people that you have.
Let's talk a little bit more about what the future looks like. So you're a botist. You're a believer that bots are the next thing?
I'm a believer that the app ecosystem has many significant challenges to it, and we've sort of reached them. And there are very few apps where the app ecosystem makes sense, apps that you use daily. But for most of the types of interactions you have with apps, I think the bot interface makes more sense. And so I do think that is the next big sort of ecosystem that we're facing in that sense, specifically in mobile.
Yeah.
Obviously,
and how are you positioning yourselves for that?
No, it's not sort of our issue in that sense.
So there's no preparations internally that you're making for that?
No preparations. There are preparations. That's sort of a vague space. But specifically what I'm saying is when people come and ask me today, like I get a lot of entrepreneurs asking me about, well, how do I get into the App Store? How do I this? The question I think they need to be asking themselves is, how do I get into the Facebook Messenger? Right? How do I get into the Amazon Echo? Right? These kinds of things are going to be new interfaces. And the only place where a startup can have a big impact is in that transitionary phase, where it's not clear exactly what's going on, the market changed, you have some value. Once the market sort of organizes itself, your value as a startup diminishes pretty dramatically. But during that transition phase, there's a lot you can do that incumbents can't do.
Right. Won't there still be the discoverability issue, even if it migrates to Messenger?
Yep, and it's, just like Apple proved that it's good to be the king, I think Facebook's going to prove the same thing. It's very good to be the king, to own that network and to be the kingmaker of the bots. WeChat, I mean, they proved it very well. How does everything break out? How do you find bots within this environment? How do you know what to ask Echo? You get this Echo, you're excited. What teaches you to even ask which questions? So there's a lot that we don't know how the market's going to play out and how the technology is going to play out. But I think for many things that today are apps, they actually are scaled down, sort of, they would have more traction as a bot than they would as an app.
So if Facebook's the king, where does that leave Google?
As the other king?
Oh, two. Okay, got it.
No, I think that there's a very interesting ecosystem that's coming out between Apple and Facebook and Google and Amazon. And I think we're seeing very interesting overlaps now happening on very different levels. I mean, Amazon's basically has tremendous hardware expertise, which we wouldn't have thought of a few years ago.
That's true.
Amazon is a cloud player, which again is something we wouldn't have thought of. If you think about Google, Google is in so many different areas today. And if you think about AI and machine intelligence and the stuff that Google does there, which are someone who's inside and gets to see what goes on inside, are way beyond anything the market can imagine. And the market imagines a lot, but it's one of the few cases where it's really ahead. Facebook has an index of all humanity that's online, basically. Right? I mean, these crazy things are going on and are overlapping. Is Facebook really going to be a hardware player? Which in a way they're beginning to move into. Apple as a hardware player. So I don't think there's a clear understanding. It's not clear who's going to be the kingmaker, but it's going to be this small a group of companies that are going to own these networks.
But one of the trends that has interested me the most, and I've been out in San Francisco a year covering technology, there's this myth, or there was this perception that startups would rise and dislodge the incumbents, right? And the large tech giants have been remarkably adept at either snapping up the startups or pivoting before they need to. Do you think that will continue?
I think there's a pyramid. And at the top of the pyramid, every 10 years, we create a market leader, which lasts for 50 or 100 years or whatever it is. And Facebook was that for 10 years ago, and I think probably Uber is the one from the current generation. And so there definitely is going to be that. People ask a lot of times, when do you sell the company, et cetera? I think we're in a world today that if you are doing something interesting, which is important to the market, you will have to sell your company at a certain point, or someone else is going to run you over time. Not because you're not great, but just because the portfolio that large tech companies have today, and the value that you get from having multiple billion user apps, right, or services, is something that at the end creates a certain value that is going to be very hard to deal with. Every decade, though, or something, there will be a new one of these decacorns, or whatever you want to call them, but there will be these platforms that get invented. And I think right now, the next platform is still a startup. So it's definitely, every startup has that chance. But if you look at Snapchat, Snapchat is amazing. What, is the question time up? I don't understand. Oh. I think our time's up.
Finish the Snapchat and then we will break the lunch.
No, I think Snapchat is right now, I think, on that track potentially to become a platform, just from the user adoption. WhatsApp was. I'm a strong believer that if WhatsApp had not been acquired by Facebook, they would be the platform today in the West, and they would have made it in the US as well. Right? I mean, things would have happened very, very differently. I think it was a brilliant move from Facebook, right. What they did. But these kinds of platforms, I mean, WhatsApp is the example that 30 guys in a room and girls in a room can create a platform literally overnight with no resources and become the platform.
But with Snapchat, the question is execution and whether they're going to pull it off, whether they're going to have a Twitter-like fate or a Facebook-like fate. And where would you put your money right now when it comes to Snapchat?
I look at what my kids do, right? And I try to spend every certain amount of time, have my kids walk me through what they're doing. The only two brands my kids really know, three brands, I guess. There's Apple, there's YouTube, and there's Snapchat. Those are the only brands that matter to them. And so I think there's if you look at that, you can see sort of what the next battlefront is for these kids.
As a journalist, it's very depressing because I've asked teenagers whether they'd subscribe to any of the things they see on Discover, any of that magazines, and they're like, why would we do that when we get that for free on Snapchat, which hopefully will not come to fruition, at least for The Economist. Anyways, thank you very much. Enjoy lunch. And thank you, Noam.